So maybe I'll just spend just a couple of minutes talking about my own perspective on Copaganda and my own journey to thinking and so much about it and writing a little bit about it, and how it connects to the work that I've been doing in my legal career. And then maybe hopefully by that point, someone will have a question or a comment. We can have a discussion from there. So I began my career as a public defender, representing people who were accused of federal crimes, but who couldn't afford an attorney in Alabama. And then I moved to Washington, D.C., where I became a public defender in D.C. And then after about 4.5 years being public defender, I got a grant to start a nonprofit organization with the goal of challenging a lot of the systemic injustices in the criminal punishment bureaucracy around the country using civil rights cases, so civil cases, and to try to attack not just things you might read about in the newspaper as sort of like a salacious, horrible example, like a police shooting or something like that, but really to attack the injustices that were very much a part of the everyday assembly line functioning of this bureaucracy, the things that were horrific and brutal, but also really normalized, such that like the people who are involved in the system have become really desensitized to them. And one of the things we can talk about a little bit later is like, there's a lot of things that are like obviously Copaganda, but then there's a lot of how the news media talks about what happens in the criminal punishment system, and not just the news media, but like public officials, private actors, et cetera, that isn't like sort of like overt misinformation, but that is designed to normalize and designed to get us to think that everything that's happening is just as it should be and nothing to see here, right? From the words they use to the context, to the stories they tell, to the stories they don't tell, et cetera. So I started doing that work, and I started doing civil rights cases around the country, challenging things like the money bail system, the criminalization of poverty, prosecutor misconduct, police abuse, et cetera. And in the course of that work, I'm really tried to work with organizers and people who are most directly impacted by these systems of state violence to do the legal work in a context that helped them build the power that was necessary to try to change how the... We have a doorbell ringing for those of you online. There's like a line around the block, so it's really popular. So, you know, one of the things that you know, in the course of working with people who have been harmed by these systems, and also people in the communities that have not been made any safer by these systems of state violence, and in the course of working in particular with organizers who were building campaigns like defund campaigns that you know are the subject of this exhibit here at the Interference Archive. And I want to thank the archive for hosting this event and getting us all together. In the context of working with people on the ground, participating in those campaigns, participating in a broader movement to try to change the way that our society thinks about human caging and the associated systems of surveillance and control and punishment, I became really alarmed at how, in particular, the news media and certain interests who use the news media to disseminate like their perspective were covering basic issues of safety. And so I started posting about it online and started writing a little bit more about it, started doing a lot of behind the scenes stuff. So meeting with, at this point, hundreds of journalists, filmmakers, producers, editors, like going to train other organizations, public defenders, how to think about a language and narrative and how important it is. And also spending some time like meeting with newsrooms all together, doing trainings and introducing people to like a different way of thinking about these issues that they've covered. So in the course of that work, I've come to see, and this is going to be an oversimplification, but I want to be really, really brief. I've come to see Copaganda as serving really like 3 main functions. The first is that I think one of the main functions, and you can call it a goal. A goal sort of expresses an intent. And I actually think that, like, while a lot of it is certainly intentional, I think a better way of understanding it is there's a wide range of actors, each having their own sort of different set of motivations and incentives and norms and blind spots, behaving as a whole with a certain intent. But I use the word function just because I think not everyone who does this at every given moment is actually exhibiting the same kind of intent. But I think, like, the first major function of Copaganda as a whole is it narrows our conception of safety. And there's so many risks to our health and safety all over the place, right? We're only urgently worried about some of them in our society. There are many other huge risks that are virtually ignored. And I think so one of the main things Copaganda does is it distorts our conception of what things are most affecting our health, well-being, and safety. So for example, you see a lot of TV news and radio and print coverage of shoplifting from drugstores. You see a lot of coverage of so-called violence in poor communities. You see anecdote after anecdote after anecdote, night after night after night, mugshot after mugshot after mugshot. What you don't see are nightly news stories about air pollution caused by large corporations illegally emitting substances into the air. Now, air pollution in the US kills over 100,000 people every single year, which is 5 times the number of all murders across the US, okay? So it's orders of magnitude more serious in terms of, like, a threat to our lives, right? Not to mention all of the forms of cancer and asthma and other respiratory illnesses that are caused by air pollution. Because it's not treated as a nightly news story in the local news, all of the companies every single day that are spewing toxic stuff into the air in Houston, in Los Angeles, in New Orleans, are not thought of as threats to public safety. And yet the conduct that they're engaged in is way more serious of a threat to public safety than all murder combined, right? And murder is a really serious threat to public safety. So I could say the same thing for water pollution, right? There are 100,000 known and tracked illegal violations of the Federal Clean Water Act. That's not to mention all the violations of local and state, this is every year, not to mention all the violations of local and state illegal dumping laws, et cetera. So much so that the water systems of every major American city are incredibly polluted with lead. And kind of ironically, one of the main contributors to so-called violent crime is actually lead exposure in children. It's one of the many factors that people have identified as actually contributing to violent crime. Now, I have my own thoughts about that, but I'm just saying, even for those criminologists and researchers who think that and who write and talk about it as if it's a big problem, the most significant cause is actually traceable to water and air pollution, right? Not anything that the police are doing. I'll get to that in a minute. I could go on and on and on, but I think just another really clear, really good example is wage theft, right? So we don't really track wage theft in this country because the police don't record it and don't investigate it, and prosecutors don't pursue it. So we actually really have no idea how much wage theft there is. The estimates that are most widely publicized are about $50 billion a year. So it's 5 times all the other property crime combined, right? And wage theft typically is from companies from low-wage workers, right? So it dwarfs by orders of magnitude all shoplifting combined. And yet every single night on the local news, you don't see the image of an employer, and you don't see employers being dragged to jail in handcuffs, et cetera, for stealing their employees' wages. Even though wage theft is associated with horrific consequences. People can't get diapers, can't get food, can't get winter clothing, can't pay their rent, can't pay their utilities. It's devastating consequences. Same with overdraft fees, et cetera. Again, we're talking billions of dollars, various forms of insurance fraud. The biggest one of all, tax evasion, about $1 trillion a year. So it's 20 times the estimates of wage theft. And yet we don't see every single night on the news. We don't see raids of wealthy people's homes. Again, it's because we're not tracking those violations. Okay, I'll pause there. So the first major thing that Copaganda does is the sheer volume of news stories and the nature of what those stories are about gives us the impression that the greatest threats to our health, well-being, and safety are the relatively narrow category of index crimes that police track and arrest poor people for, and that the FBI sort of records and publishes into the crime data that we all sort of hear about in the news. That those very narrow ranges of harm are the things that are most threatening to our health, well-being, and safety, when there are much larger crimes happening every single day that aren't being reported in the news, and then much larger harms that aren't criminal. Because again, what gets criminalized in our society is impacted by who has wealth and power in our society. So narrowing conception of safety, number one. Now, this second sort of thing that I think Copaganda does, oh, by the way, one more thing about in number one is completely ignored are all the crimes committed by cops, right? So by my estimate, if you look at sort of some of the DOJ reports on police departments, conservatively, police are committing several million physical and sexual assaults every single year. And when you add jail guards in, which is another almost 100,000 rapes every single year, I mean, mass criminality. Again, none of those are being reported in the daily news because they're not being investigated and reported by police. And so they're not coming to the news media, right? Occasionally there's an investigative news expose that'll cover it, right? But like the everyday news, radio, television is not covering those. So it's not giving the public the sense of urgency about those crimes. The second thing that I think Copaganda does is it constantly makes people afraid that the narrow range of crimes that they're covering are increasing. So if you look at the last 25 years, people in this country are constantly afraid that crime is rising, crime is increasing, right? I think the purpose of that type of propaganda or that function of propaganda is to make people constantly afraid, because people are easier to control and manipulate when they're afraid. And they tend to be more supportive of government surveillance and control and harsh punishment when they're afraid. The third, and I think maybe most important function of propaganda is, how do I put this? The way the media covers these issues gives people the false impression that tweaks in bureaucratic policy, whether it's different types of patrol by the police or police getting some new piece of equipment or body cameras or bail policy by prosecutors or mandatory minimums or prosecutor charging decisions. Basically, the marginal changes in behavior by the punishment bureaucracy actually affects crime. What we actually know, what the science actually shows us, is that the drivers of harm and violence in our world are not the little bureaucratic decisions that take place in a courtroom, not like, did the person get a 7-year sentence or a 3-year sentence, or were there 17 cops patrolling that area versus 14, or did those cops have body cameras, or did they have de-escalation training? The real drivers of harm and violence, the things that distinguish, let's say, the rates of violence in our society versus the rates of violence in other comparable countries, are big structural features of our society, like inequality, poverty, toxic masculinity, lack of access to medical care, lack of access to permanent places to live that are safe and clean. As I mentioned earlier, environmental pollutants and toxins, the levels of like trust and interpersonal connection in communities. These are the things that actually determine whether people harm each other. Availability of school, like theater, music, art programs, the availability of accessible public parks, green spaces, well-lit spaces, et cetera. These are all things that determine the levels of harm and violence in our society, even if you are focused very narrowly on the kinds of crimes police talk about in the media, not like bureaucratic changes in policy. But if you watch the media, you would be led to believe that crime is all, the fault of the new progressive DA policy, or crime is all the fault of bail reform, or crime is the fault of police being afraid to do their jobs because of the defund slogan, et cetera. I think this is the most pervasive form of propaganda, and I think it's much more subtle than I've just suggested. This kind of propaganda occurs in every single article or news story about a crime when they just are interviewing the police, because they're suggesting a link between the police and either the prevention of that crime or the creation of a society where that crime happens less. When they ask police to give them their opinion on the causes of this, when they talk about whether someone's going to be arrested for it and how that person's going to be punished, the entire juxtaposition of an act of violence with the carceral response is itself a form of propaganda. You could just as easily juxtapose every act of so-called criminal violence with statistics and data on the lack of housing, or statistics and data on the lack of spending on early childhood education, which is a huge driver of involvement in the criminal legal system for years afterward. You could just as easily juxtapose it as a medical care issue, as a mental health care investment issue, right? So anyway, I'll stop there just to pause, because I've been talking a little bit longer than I anticipated, and see if folks have thoughts, comments, questions, or any other reactions. Yeah.
Hi, Chloe, she, her pronouns. Don't know what needs of introduction makes sense, but thanks for being here. One thing, sorry, I decided I actually would feel more comfortable if you had your mask on. Do you mind doing that for the rest of the time?
Yeah.
Thank you. And then also, not to jump ahead in terms of what you're planning on sharing tonight, but I guess I'm already curious to hear your thoughts about antidotes to the functions that you laid out. Thinking in particular, I'm familiar with you and your work because I'm very online on Twitter, and thinking about how to interrupt, especially what you were describing in terms of like the daily news cycle and the kind of like volume and repetitiveness that I think most that reaches more people probably than online spaces.
Yeah, thank you, Chloe. Was that the question was audible online?
Oh,
The question was basically, what are some antidotes to some of the, there's some seats up here too, by the way, if you all want to come down, and no pressure. I know. The question was like, what are some antidotes to what I've just, summarized? And I think there are a lot of different things. And so this is not going to be an exhaustive list, and I don't purport to really be like, I guess I am speaking to you all about this, but I really don't purport to be an expert on this at all. I'm just sharing some of the things that I've seen in my own experience. There obviously communities have been dealing, as this archive and this exhibit demonstrate, communities have been dealing with propaganda for a long, long time, and different communities have adopted different strategies. So I'll just like start by outlining a few. I think number one, it can be helpful to do political education for people who are in a position to have a lot of influence. So whether that means journalists, whether that means the creators of content on social media who have large platforms, whether it means writers, producers, directors of like media that gets consumed by a lot of people. So I, for example, have done like roundtable discussions with the writers' rooms of like major TV shows, trying to get them to think a little bit differently about how they're portraying things. That's one. So like, I think I complain on Twitter a lot about like the news media, but actually where people are getting their intuitions about the world is often not like the news. It's like the kind of like more like fictional TV and movies and other things and podcasts that they consume. So intervening in those spaces and trying as much as possible to bring into those spaces people who have been most harmed by these bureaucracies of punishment and pain to talk to people about how their portrayal of those systems and these ideas is actually hurting people in the community. I think that's been very helpful and very effective. So I think like broader political education. I think the creation and funding and crowdsourcing and like development of independent media is really important. So it's just a fact that like most of the mainstream news organizations are large corporations and they're owned by very, very rich people. And so like it doesn't always determine what they do, of course, and there's many amazing people working at all of those places and trying really hard to do really good work. But there are some really systemic problems with the ownership of media and like the creation of other forms of like other formations of independent media is like super important. I think also like spaces like this, I think there's just no substitute for people being in their own community and organizing. And I think a really good development in this area has been the court watch programs that have proliferated around the country. So like many people, like my mother, when she retired, joined a local court watch program. And not only is that kind of radicalizing because you get to see the horrific nature of what happens in the court system, but you also get to meet other people in your community, you get to discuss these ideas, and you get to uncover a lot of really horrific things that are happening. You observe these bureaucrats doing incredible acts of violence, many of which are actually illegal, every single day. And many of these court watch programs are publicizing the things that they're seeing, and people are learning about them they're almost sort of like independent journalists, and not just journalists, but analysts. So I think there's also, there's different things like court watching, but I think that's one example of a way you can organize with people in your community to change how people think about these issues. I think hosting and like book clubs and reading groups and spaces in your community, in your family groups, in your friend groups, in whether there are like church spaces or like coworker spaces, etc. Like really like anything to bring people together and do like collective political education is like absolutely essential. Another thing is developing, and this is something that I've been developing, developing curricula around how to be a more critical consumer of media, so that you're not just like a passive sort of receptacle for all of the incredible propaganda that's hitting us. And it's not just on this issue. There's enormous propaganda on a wide range of issues. And so I think developing those critical like reading and critical consumption. Sorry, I'm just gonna take a deep breath. Developing those critical skills is like absolutely essential, in my opinion, to like giving people the foundation to identify and ameliorate propaganda. So those are just some ideas. There's a lot more. I certainly am doing a lot more things like behind the scenes and trying publicly. And I think just like calling it out and keeping like up the hard work of identifying it and creating a cost associated with doing it for people that are engaging in the most blatant forms of it is really important. And actually, there are a lot of like very well-meaning people that are engaging in a lot of this harmful propaganda. And so I think the final thing I'll say to answer your question is there are different solutions for different propaganda actors, because propaganda range, there's a spectrum, right? There's some really bad faith stuff, like if you watch what's happening on Fox News, for example, or Herman Lopez in the New York Times, there's like really bad faith stuff, people who know they're lying and continue to do it and have an agenda to support the police. There's a few major professors who are in that category as well, who keep getting quoted in all these news stories. But then there's like a spectrum, right? There are journalists who have maybe only been talking to those people, and so they've been kind of like brainwashed, but like once they've like there's many journalists at many of these major outlets who like started there, but in my time talking to them have really moved. And then there are people who sort of in the middle who like haven't really gone either way, but have learned some of the conventions of this stuff in a bad way. And like for those people, the intervention might be like helping them understand the harm that what they're doing is causing. And then there are like people who are sympathetic, but who like maybe don't have all of the tools associated with, or maybe like they don't have enough relationships with people in communities who are organizing against these systems, so that like their stories aren't as good as they could be because they're not really featuring people in the community that are fighting. So like there are many journalists I know who are sympathetic and well-meaning, but like they wouldn't have the first idea how to find a crime survivor who has a deep analysis and is organizing around a local campaign to close the jail or something like that. And so like some of this work is also connecting people to each other, so that journalists can develop deeper networks, even if they are sympathetic. Anyone else? The questions?
How have those conversations at newsrooms worked out for you? Like, have you seen pushback from people who are kind of higher up the food chain with those kind of dialogue sessions?
Yeah, so the question is how the conversations have worked and how they've gone with some of the media organizations. I think it's a mixed bag. There's a contingent of people in the media world who like hate me and hate the fact that I'm posting on Twitter and being critical. And those criticisms tend to be like, I can't think of a single time when someone has really like criticized me on the merits of what I'm saying. It all tends to get focused on, well, it's my tone that's bad, or I'm being too arrogant, or other than like friends of mine who will like point out when I make mistakes, or like when my tone is arrogant or something like that. But like I haven't really had like a lot of experience with like mainstream journalists critiquing like the merits of what I'm saying. It's been mostly deflection and very defensive for the people that are negative. But I would say the vast majority, or like the strong majority, are actually positive. There are people who engage with me. There are people who say, like, that makes sense. I hadn't thought about what you're saying. Like, can you give me like a different way of doing it? Or can you introduce me to someone who would have a different perspective? I found it to be pretty constructive for the most part. Now, there is a small group of people that will not speak to me, that will not engage with me, that don't respond when I ask them questions. So like, I don't want to make it seem like it's all great. I mean, there are lots of people who are very upset about what I'm doing, even on social media, when I critique them. But I've been actually pretty heartened by it. And I keep getting invited to these newsrooms and other places. And so that shows at least some interest in like being self-critical about this stuff. And many of the things that I post online actually come from journalists at the institution I'm critiquing. So they're not a monolith, right? Like people will message me and say, hey, did you see what my colleague just did? I think it's really problematic. I can't say anything about it, but could you like take a look at it? So I think that's also really encouraging. Like some of the critique that I'm doing is not necessarily designed to persuade the person I'm critiquing. It's designed to persuade other people who are observing, who aren't maybe as defensive or as invested in it, but who can see, maybe they don't agree with everything I say. And I'm sure people do have like critiques on the merits of some of what I say, that they just don't want to get. I mean, no one's required to have a conversation with me. So like, there might be stuff out there, but like, but they get something from watching the exchange, and I've had a number of reporters reach out to me like that as well. But we're up against a really big, I mean, I don't spend a lot of time on the film and TV side of this stuff. And like, that's where a lot of the harm is being done. So like, I think in those spaces, the financial pressures are enormous. And I think that it's a kind of a different ballgame than with journalists. And that's an area that I would expect to maybe have less success with the kinds of like reasoned argument that I make. And, it's just, we're going to have to probably have different kinds of interventions there. I mean, you can do some work along the margins, but it's hard.
I'm curious about the police seem to be very politically organized in terms of having powerful unions. And it seems like even people with a great deal of power have trouble challenging them and reforming them. So I wonder if you'll talk about that.
Yeah, so the question was, should I be repeating these for the
I
online?
think it's helpful, yeah,
Okay.
totally.
The question was like, hey, the police are really powerful. Even like people who seem to have a lot of power in our society, when they confront the police, like they're not able to get anything done. So like, what should we do about that? If I had a good answer to that question, it would be like the most important moment of my career. If I could feel like I was working on a strategy that would actually reduce the size and power of the police, it would feel like, I mean, I guess what I want to say is, I don't know. I can offer a couple of like preliminary thoughts, but this is a really tough, I mean, people have been organizing and fighting against the police since as long as the police have existed. And there's a great Michel Foucault line that I have in my book about how like part of the nature of prison reform, part of the nature of prisons is like the urge to reform them, basically. And the same is true with police. Like, because of the nature of what they do, like it's always been like, ever since we've had what we now think of as like what now look like modern police forces, everyone is saying, oh my gosh, you have to reform these things. Precisely because like the violence that they perpetrate, I don't just mean like the overt violence. I mean, like the main function of police is to preserve the way our society looks. And the imminent threat of police force is how you can have a situation in a society where there are many, many, many people who don't have a place to stay tonight, and many, many, many empty places to stay. It's how you can create a situation where there are places with lots of food on the shelves, but many people who don't have anything to eat. It's the imminent threat of violence to put chains on your body and take you to a cage that makes that kind of arrangement possible. And that is like the imminent violence that's all around us in the ether. It's not the violence that police do when they beat someone or when they tase someone or they shoot someone. And so part of what gives police the power that they have is people in our society who own things understand at a very subconscious and often conscious level that the thing that's enabling them to hoard the things that they own is this like force of state violence. And so I think one reason that like it's very hard to reduce the size and power of police is that no matter how much moderate and liberal people talk about police reform, they understand at a very deep level that the police make the inequality that they benefit from possible. That's what do you do with that is a really hard question. I think the answer is really basic. It's like reducing inequality and organizing. And the more you reduce inequality, the less powerful police will become, because police are in one of their primary functions is to be an agent and protector of that inequality. Now, this is kind of circular though, because one of the main functions of police throughout the course of the last 150 years is crushing any progressive social movement that seeks more equality. It's why police surveil and infiltrate core organizers in every major social movement that we've ever seen, from women trying to get the right to vote to Black people organizing. Virtually every time Black people have ever organized in this country's history, to like the incredible and brutal police attacks on queer communities, et cetera. I mean, it's on and on and on and on, immigrant communities, et cetera. environmental justice, animal rights, right? So if there's a left-wing social movement, the police are spying on it and brutally crushing it. So it's a little bit circular, because how do you reduce inequality without reducing the size and power of police? And this is like, where do you break into this cycle? And so one of the reasons that I just think we need to be having the conversation about police as a protector of inequality, so that people, like, there are a lot of really well-meaning people who don't want our society to look as unequal as it does. In fact, the vast majority of people in this country think, if you look at polls, people think our society is much more equal than it is, and they want it to be way more equal than they think it is. So it's actually like, we're like really far away from the ideal, from, you know, the vast majority, like super majorities of the population want it to be more equal. And so I take heart in that. And I also take heart in a lot of the really amazing organizing that people are doing. The other thing that I think we'll say to reduce the size and power of police is to build non-police alternatives every single day that we can see, touch, feel, and participate in. Like networks of mutual aid have existed since way before police were like a formal thing. Communities helped each other do what they need to do. They kept each other safe. They look out for each other. They help each other with all of the problems that we now, like in our society, are paying police to make worse. So like, I think mutual aid is probably the most exciting development. Like the increase in excitement and interest and education on mutual aid programs in the last 2 years has been one of the most exciting developments, because that is a way of reducing the size and power of police. People are now organized and can take on the things that the local government is going to be facing a lot of political pressure to give the police. And then I think another way of reducing their size and power is what I was talking about earlier, fighting against propaganda and developing more critical thinking skills in the population will help, like, protect people against a lot of the fear mongering that's happening, and that's really important as well. So I think journalism can play an enormous role, right? Journalism could be exposing a lot of the fraud, waste, and abuse in the police bureaucracies. It could be helping people to see the urgent problems that police are causing. Academics can play a big role, and instead of shilling for police and getting paid as consultants to boost police and to promote ever more ludicrous reforms of police, the academic community could get together and say, we're going to start like with a research agenda that actually shows people that not only are these other alternatives much better for safety, but the way that we've thought about police and the way that we've been researching and writing about police is actually complicit in these problems in similar ways to the media. So I think different domains in our society can play different roles in reducing the size and power of police. I think the labor movement as well. Many of the main labor organizations are completely infiltrated by police and have police union members even. But then there's like unions like teachers, nurses, home healthcare workers, and others who like actually should start seeing that like they're competing with the police for scarce local resources. So when the police budget increases, that's money that could actually have gone to mental health crisis responders, social workers, teachers, after school education programs, early childhood development, et cetera. And there should be a battle. Those professions should organize around this issue and understand that there's actually like a competition here. And if those organized interests took up this fight, the domain of local politics in a lot of cities around the country would be really, really different. Same with tenant unions and other like sort of housing organizing, right? Like there are like centers of power that actually like haven't overtly gotten in as much as I think they could and should in coalition with each other around reducing the size and power of police as a shared goal for each of their movements. Yeah.
Hi, Alex. My name's Harris. Kind of a two-part question. Is there, do other countries have the same system of propaganda as severe as ours? And also, is there a country or society out there that you look to that could serve as maybe as an example of where we should get to?
That's a great question. The question was, do other countries have the same level of propaganda, and is there like a country that we should be looking to as a more of a model? I actually don't know enough to answer your question intelligently. So it's a little bit of a cop out, but like, I don't purport to be an expert in how the media covers police in other countries. I suspect many of the same problems exist. So one of the best books, maybe probably the best book ever written on this topic, is called Policing the Crisis, which is an amazing book by Stuart Hall, the Jamaican British scholar, Marxist scholar, sociologist. It was many things, and a group of other academics writing in the 70s in England. They didn't use the word propaganda, but it's a very lengthy study of how the media and the court system in England concocted the notion of mugging and created a moral panic around mugging in England. And they actually analyze how the same thing happened in the US first, and how England sort of imported a lot of the tactics, and they analyze media articles and they analyze political actors. And so, like, highly recommend Stuart Hall's book, Policing the Crisis. You can read it for free online. It's incredible. So like, I suspect this is a problem everywhere there are police forces that are enforcing coercion, control, and inequality, which is basically everywhere. I think the myths and the strategies and the narratives are probably a little bit different. This country's, propaganda in this country, is probably going to have different racial undertones, for example, than propaganda in other places. But I suspect everywhere police are the means of state violence preserving an unequal status quo, there are going to be mythologies and narratives that the police are telling the public about why they're doing what they're doing. So I would not anticipate it to be non-existent elsewhere, but I would anticipate it being worse in places where there's more inequality, because the nature and extent to which you have to deceive people is more serious in countries like ours that are incredibly unequal.
Yeah, because also like a sign the difference between like crime and then mental health. It has to be like another issue because between like all the vibe between like brutality and other things. We'll all go back with red line. We'll go like we'll start with like between the 40s, 50s, and of course the 60s, where all the massive displacement throughout the major cities. 50 the inner cities that have been plagued by crime and court of violence. Also that they were riots that have been plagued on. So what is the difference between people are home, some of the criminal are homeless, some of them are emotionally disturbed, and they're attacking citizens in disguise. But what's the basis between drugs and the mental health and the mental illness that they plague ever been since?
That's a really great question. So the question for people online has to do with like, there's all these other bigger things that are connected to crime, like redlining and the way in which concentrated poverty was a deliberate creation of the government and wealthy people in this country, which is now, associated with like high crime neighborhoods, the sort of impact of mental illness and addiction on what is, classified as crime in our society. And these are like super important points. And I think they tie really perfectly into propaganda, because one of the goals of propaganda is to trick people into thinking that like the so-called disorder that they see on the streets is connected to bad people doing bad things instead of like very like intentional, deliberate policy decisions that were made for the purpose of profit for some people that created very predictably exactly what we're seeing now. The same is true with the war on drugs, right? Which we know was a deliberate propaganda strategy to fearmonger, and no one ever believed that the war on drugs was going to actually reduce the availability of drugs in our communities. And then I think, you know, we just have to say that, like, the local jail in every major American city is the single largest provider of mental health services in our society. So there has been a massive criminalization of mental illness, and that's been very profitable for a number of groups in our society. And it is, you know, a shame. It's sort of a shameful chapter in this country's history over the last 40 years. And we're not going to be able to dismantle these systems unless we also build community-based places that people can get the care they need. And that's just not happening right now. And instead, we are warehousing people in horrific violence and re-traumatizing people every single day at places like Rikers, et cetera. So yeah, that was, yeah, I think, very, very important to bring that into the space.
We have a question from Zoom about you mentioned lead poisoning and its connection to crime. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, you can read about this. There's a journalist who's actually consolidated a lot of the evidence around this. I think his name is Kevin Drum. And I think it's mostly collected in several Mother Jones articles where he's collected all the scientific studies on this. But for one of the most significant factors that explains the fluctuations in US crime is the extent to which there's been significant lead abatement across the country. And you can sort of, the crux of a lot of the research is based on the fact that different communities significantly abated lead in their gasoline at different times. And so you can actually see how it correlates on like a 20 or 15 or 20 year time lag based on, you know, when there were significant efforts in different jurisdictions to abate lead. And for a long time, you know, people like neurologists like understood the connection between lead exposure in children and IQ. But the theory is basically that lead exposure in children also leads to changes in things like impulse control, et cetera. So it's actually like a really interesting form of environmental racism is the extent to which when they created these red line communities of concentrated deprivation, it often, you know, magically coincided with communities that were dumping grounds for major corporate waste. And so it's not just lead. There's so many other things we probably don't even understand or don't even really appreciate or know about the extent to which like different chemical pollutants and irritants are affected or are sort of influencing so much of life in so many communities that are themselves in complex ways related to crime and violence and harm. That's another thing that's really silly about a lot of the propaganda. Like, these are really complex social phenomena. We have no clue what causes all of the interconnected things that lead to you know, certain forms of harm in our society, right? And to suggest that, like, you know, that it's like bail reform or something like that is just so silly. I mean, it's like climate science denial, and so I think it's really important we're just beginning to scratch the surface of our knowledge. And different people debate the extent to which lead really explains how much of this stuff lead really explains. And I'm not like a proponent of any one of these theories in particular. I just want to make the point tonight that like the idea that the little policy tweaks that judges, prosecutors, cops, jail guards, et cetera, probation officers, parole officers, the idea that the things they do are like a significant driver of this is like completely ludicrous. And there's all these other things that we actually know play a role. And it's sort of one of the most harmful aspects of propaganda is it takes our attention away from those other things, because improving those other things doesn't just benefit us by reducing harm in our society through reducing violence. It also benefits us in many other ways. Like people are safer and healthier. They're getting sick less, right? They're getting into, they're able to spend more time with their families and friends in school, et cetera. And so there's all these other ancillary benefits that don't show up just in the crime rates.
As a former public defender in Alabama, I'd be kind of interested to just like hear your thoughts about the strike that's going on across like Alabama, several Alabama prisons now, and maybe like I guess also I haven't seen a lot of coverage of it in like major media publications. I don't know, I'd just be interested to hear some of your thoughts.
Yeah, I was actually just down there last weekend. I don't purport to be like involved in any way, or even like that knowledgeable of what's happening. I've read a little bit and talked to some folks who are in touch with people on the inside, but it's not something that I'm involved with in any way at all. So it doesn't feel, I can't really speak about it in any kind of real way. What I will say is the news media ignores most of the important drivers of world events in favor of like powerful people and like shiny events. Whereas like the things that are actually driving social change are like movements and like longer term and more structural features of our society. And I think so that's one point. So like a second point is prison riots and prison uprisings and prison violence has been almost completely ignored and swept under the rug throughout this country's history. And I think there's a fantastic, some of you might have read Blood in the Water, which is an incredible account of the Attica uprisings. Also highly recommend to you listening to or watching on YouTube the Muhammad Ali poem about the Attica prison uprisings, which is really beautiful. But like it's taken extraordinary efforts by people like Muhammad Ali, by like historians and journalists to even get the public to the very limited, very basic level of knowledge that we have about even some of the most significant prison uprisings in US history. But that doesn't mean, like I said a minute ago, that they don't have enormous impact on our society. They do. They change, they build political consciousness among so many people on the inside and their families. They radicalize people. They are a brief window for people on the outside who like don't understand exactly what goes on inside our cages. And they're a moment of real political education, I think, for anyone who pays attention to them. So I think it's very important that we try to figure out how to get the news media to cover what happens in a more comprehensive way. And I don't know how to do that. I've been talking to some journalists about trying to get people to cover things like this more significantly. I've been actually working, one of the reasons I haven't been following the Alabama stuff as much is that this last week or two I've been working on just catastrophic situation inside the jail in Houston, where over 20 people have died this year just in that jail alone. Incredible abuse of pregnant people and horrific beatings and physical and sexual violence. I mean, it's just that no one's getting the meds they need, et cetera. And like, we need to figure out a way of covering the things that are happening and the incredible organizing that people's families are doing on the outside as well, to try to change what's happening on the inside. And it's hard to get journalists interested in it. And that's one main reaction I have, is like, the reason that the Alabama uprisings aren't like public knowledge right now, and everyone talking about them, is that there's not a lot of journalists who have the relationships with sources to actually cover that and cover it in a way that does it justice. And so that's more of a longer term problem, right? Like, we have to figure out, like, how do we get more journalists with the right level of access, so that when they do cover it, they're not covering, like we saw with the Attic uprising, all the initial media, where they're not covering like what the prison guards are saying and what the wardens are saying, but they're actually covering like the sort of struggle that and they have enough of the context to understand and to put in more of a comprehensive context for readers, like, why is this happening? And how does it connect to other prison uprisings in the past? And what does it say about like the system in Alabama that like they are making these demands at this moment? So anyway, I don't have a lot to say about it because I'm not really well versed in exactly what's going on now, but it's I have been thinking about it a little bit.
One more question for the Zoom.
Sure.
Okay. How has Copaganda responded to sought to contain and discredit the movement for police abolition in the Florida uprising?
How did
how has Copaganda responded to or discredited the movement for police abolition, like in the last couple of years?
How has Copaganda discredited the movement for police abolition? I mean, in virtually every way. I mean, I think we've seen everything I've said tonight, applies to that. Like, we've seen an incredible effort, unlike any I've seen since I've been, working in the system for the last 17 years. We've seen an incredible reactionary and highly organized response to the uprisings of 2020. And in virtually everything, I mean, I think one way that I wrote about today on Twitter, just for example, is the willful and complete distortion of the concept of defunding the police. And like the way in which that the media has simplified and distorted and manipulated what that concept means and what it could mean and what people who are organizing mean by it, in favor of like a very simplistic and racist and fear-mongering narrative, is like really something to behold. I mean, you had like professors at fancy universities and like the New York Times publishing repeatedly just like absolute nonsense, like the George Floyd protests increased crime by making police afraid to do their job. I mean, that was like there's just so many layers of which that's absurd, right? Because it, first of all, relies on the, many of the claims are that defunding did that, right? But there wasn't defunding. It relies on the idea that police actually reduce crime when they try to reduce crime, which is also untrue. And it relies on the idea that police were somehow not doing their job or afraid to do their job when they killed more people in 2021 than they did in 2020. So none of it made any sense. And yet you have millions of people who get the morning newsletter in the New York Times reading this nonsense. I think they were actually very successful in getting a sort of conventional wisdom accepted in all corners of the media. And if you talk to even people that support defund, like who identify as supporting defund, I mean, actually, as I wrote today on Twitter, most people, when you actually ask them more specific questions, like, do you support reallocating parts of the police budget toward mental health and social services, et cetera, like over 60% of conservatives support that. And 75% of people who live with a police officer support that. So it's like overwhelming, like, and 70% of the whole population on the survey that I was talking about today. But like when even the people who consciously support defund, they think that the general public doesn't support it. because there's this conventional wisdom that it's not popular. And that's really because the term has been so vilified and so distorted that no one actually means the same thing by it, and they don't know what people are talking past each other. Like in my newsletter yesterday, I wrote about how I was invited to give a talk at like a very fancy university, and I'm with the political science department, and like we went to dinner with the professors, and like all of them are saying it's such a waste, and like nobody should be talking about defund because people don't support it, and like it's a lost cause, and it doesn't make any sense, and it's never going to happen because people don't support it. And like I just asked a bunch of follow-up questions, and each of them had like a different understanding of what defund meant, different idea, like you're completely talking past each other, just like not serious at all. And I think that's partly because of the way the media has covered defund. There has been very few local articles when I've searched where there's been a real effort to understand exactly what demands the organizers are making and why, and what kinds of alternatives they envision replacing. Sometimes it happens, but by and large, it doesn't. And I think that's one example of how Copaganda has really helped destroy the movement. They took a conventional wisdom that something dramatic needed to happen with US policing, and they fear-mongered and fear-mongered and fear-mongered and fear-mongered and sort of distorted their way to now a conventional wisdom where everyone thinks, yeah, not only is policing like we need it because everyone is afraid and there's so much crime, we need to expand it. We need to give the police more power. And it's been a remarkable turnaround and very well done.